Hi guys, welcome back to The Thoughtful Advocate. I'm your host, Elizabeth Teo. Now, we all want to change the world, but most of us don't know where to start. So I'm sitting down with the Thoughtful Advocates, the people turning hope into action. And today's guest is an environmental educator and advocate who grew up in Hong Kong. So I'm very excited to introduce to you Eugenia here. Eugenia, do you want to give your pronouns just so be respectful?
Yeah, my name is Eugenia and my pronouns are she, her.
Perfect. And so for today's activity, we're going to do a little show and tell. It's the first time doing this. You can show your meaningful object and just introduce a little bit about yourself and why this object is so meaningful to you.
Cool. I have a bottle of cactus wine. And the reason why I chose this object is because this cactus wine is made out of opuntia cactus, which is an invasive species in the region that I'm currently living in, Kenya. But it represents a sense of regeneration, which is something that I like to promote in my work because it takes something that's typically invasive but transforms it into a product that people buy and enjoy. It communicates a lot about how we can reframe different situations, especially when it comes to the environmental movement, how we can turn things that might seem like they're harming our environment into something that is more hopeful and optimistic as well. And that's the philosophy that I want to carry into this conversation as well.
That's amazing. I did not know they even made cactus wines, so that in itself is really,
something new
really
to
awesome.
me as well.
But no, I really like the idea of turning like invasive species, because invasive species are everywhere. Like I remember in high school, we did like an ivy pull, and it was just like so much. And so to actually do something with something that's seen as like unwanted and turning it into something that people actually want, I think that's really cool. And is that like local to your reserve? Is that like how you found out about it, or is this something that you knew about before?
No, I recently learned about it. I know that I had learned about this invasive cactus before because it's all scattered around the reserve that I'm living on, but this wine, they produce it at a food security center, which is in this region, and so this is a semi-arid region, and so they try to promote food security in ways that are compatible to this environment. And so one of the things that they highlight is the fact that you can transform this invasive species into this product, improve food security as well through that.
So you built such an incredible journey from growing up in Hong Kong to studying at UNC Chapel Hill and traveling around the world through your scholarship, and now working as a conservation specialist on a wildlife reserve in Kenya. When you look back at where you started and where you are now, what does that moment feel like to you? Does it feel surreal? Can you picture like little Eugenia and if she was here right now?
Yeah, it definitely feels surreal. And I think every year this happens where I'll end up somewhere or end up doing something where a month ago or a year ago I would have never imagined. And I think the fact that I'm currently living at a wildlife research center and get to be surrounded with all these insanely cool wildlife in Kenya is something that I just never would have dreamed of. And I think it's really exciting to think of all these opportunities that I never would have imagined before and think of how that could be a possibility in the future where maybe the job description, my future job description doesn't even exist right now, or it's not something that I even have the capacity to imagine. And I think that feels really exciting and is something that I'm very happy about.
Is this something you always wanted to do? Did you always picture yourself working on a wildlife reserve as like a little girl?
No, not at all. So I had no background in wildlife or anything of the sorts. I honestly didn't even know that I knew people who did research in wildlife, but it's just not something that I had ever dreamed of or was interested in just because I guess it's not something I was exposed to growing up. I ended up here in a pretty random way. I applied to a fellowship where they match you with different organizations on the continent just based on their different fields. There's conservation, education, there's economic development, and there's also some in healthcare. And I ended up getting matched with Impala Research Center, which is where I am now. I think it's been really interesting to see how conservation and wildlife connects to all these other interests that I had previously. So my background is in food systems and global development, and seeing how that all connects has been really fascinating, especially since it's not something that I ever expected to do before.
Yeah, I think that's really awesome. Especially when I was growing up, these kind of jobs, they weren't really talked about or encouraged because they usually, coming from an Asian family, it was like you either become a doctor, an engineer, or a lawyer. There's no such thing as going into an environmental like sustainability or anything like that. So yeah, I wasn't even aware that people who I guess look like us could even do these kinds of things. So I think it's really cool that your journey brought you here, and it seems like it's been very fulfilling for you. And I love seeing your videos on Instagram. It looks really fun.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been awesome so far.
So can you give us a quick snapshot of what you're working on right now as a Princeton in Africa Fellow, and how you're bridging conservation, science, and climate education? I specifically loved how you highlighted that you don't need a science degree to work on a wildlife reserve. I think that's something a lot of people don't know about, because when you think of wildlife reserve, you think of the people doing the research, but there's so many other roles on the reserve. So if you could talk about that'd be great.
So my role is sponsored through the Princeton Africa Fellowship, and my title officially at Impala Research Center is the Communications and Outreach Lead. And in this role, I manage all our social medias, our newsletter, and just our internal and external communication. But in the outreach part of the role, I also work with researchers to disseminate their research. And so that can look like documenting their work through social media. It can also involve connecting with local schools or local communities to ensure that their research impacts the broader community. And so a lot of that involves partnering with different organizations and institutions and finding ways to collaborate. One example that I'm really proud and excited about is this school that we recently partnered with, Cote d'Ivoire Academy. And so they are a high school for girls from disadvantaged backgrounds, and something that we are working with them to do is rebuild their conservation clubs. And so we are bringing researchers in to teach them about conservation, and also bringing their students in to gain internship opportunities through working with our researchers. And I think it's this really beneficial collaboration that promotes conservation education, but also supports a really important cause. And so that's how I'm trying to bridge conservation science with climate education and really make that accessible for people.
Yeah, I think that's really cool how you're working with the local communities, because I think that's so important when you visit a place like this, and really anywhere. Oh, I was going to ask, do you feel like your social media, because you're on social media through your Instagram and other accounts, do you feel like that helped you when you applied to this fellowship?
I think not so much the fellowship, but so after you get into the candidate pool for the fellowship, they put you forward for different positions. And I think it made me more competitive for this position because it was communications focused. And so having that social media experience and background in communicating environmental climate topics, I think went a really long way in demonstrating that this is the type of work that I have done before and can carry out for an organization.
Like, you have the real life experience. So I think that's really cool, and goes to show that it's not always about the degree that you have, but if you have real life experience, that really helps too. So we'll dive into your origin story now. So growing up in Hong Kong with your international upbringing, how did that unique culture environment shape your early understanding of global issues and sustainability? Was sustainability talked about in Hong Kong, or was that not really something that was brought up?
Sustainability started to become more embedded into my school curriculum in my later years. Looking back now at my upbringing, sustainability was always very integral to the way that I was raised. And I think maybe you can relate to this with Asian parents, because my mom, for example, every time she'd go to the grocery store, she would save every single bag and keep them in a drawer and have them folded up so that we could reuse them another time. And all our towels that we would use to clean the table would be old t-shirts or rags that they didn't want to throw away because they wanted to be resourceful and keep them. I think maybe in the moment I didn't realize it, but I was always being taught this sustainable lifestyle of how to be resourceful and reuse instead of purchasing single-use items, and also being a lot more mindful about our consumption. And so I think that was always embedded into my upbringing, and something that I really appreciate that was instilled in me from a young age, because I think it has really shaped the way that I use materials and the way that I navigate the world in terms of appreciating the resources that I have and how to extend their life rather than dispose of them and constantly purchase new things.
Do you feel that because your parents took those actions, it had a deeper impact on you than just hearing about sustainable issues? Or do you think the combination of the two, the sustainable education and seeing people in your family actually do that without saying, hey, this is sustainable, or hey, this is zero waste, and not labeling it, but actually putting it to practice? Do you feel like those were impactful together?
Yeah, I think the pairing really helps to reinforce each other. So I think having the education alone is one thing, but it's so much of your learning happens at home as well as the classroom.
Yeah.
And so they really reinforce each other. And I think because I witnessed that growing up, it felt like the norm for me, where when we were learning about these things, it almost felt strange that we had to learn about it when it was just how I was taught to live. And so I think in many ways, having that reinforcement was a reminder of how crucial it is that we have that mindset. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I moved out 2 years ago. My aunts and my mom, they all had containers, drawers full of containers. So now I have drawers specifically dedicated to takeout containers that we wash and reuse. I feel like it really does make an impact on you, the way you grow up. So speaking about that impact, how did your family react when you first started Vegan HK? I know that was your previous username, and specifically when you got interested in plant-based eating and climate activism. Was this a familiar path in your household? Was veganism even talked about or encouraged, or were you completely blazing new ground?
Yeah, it definitely wasn't something that my family was used to. I think in Chinese culture, it's not very common to avoid meat, and so I think it was very new to my parents, and at first they thought it was just a fad or something that I was going to do for a month and then give up afterwards. But I think when I proved to them that it was something I was really determined to do and serious about, they were a lot more accepting. And I think when I was starting to eat more plant-based food, I had to put in a lot more effort on my end to learn different recipes and also find places to eat that were compatible with my diet so that I wasn't putting the burden on them. And I think that also made them more accepting of the shift in my lifestyle. But yeah, it definitely wasn't easy to do it in a Chinese household where a lot of the food we eat is meat. So it was definitely a lot of learning and figuring out how to navigate that. And that's also why I started Vegan HK in the first place, was because I wanted to make that more accessible for other people. And I also made it easier for me to find places to have that community of people who were going through a similar journey.
I really like that. I did try to go vegetarian for a year or so when I was living with my aunts, and yeah, I remember telling my grandma about it, and she was like, oh, are you becoming Buddhist? Is that what's happening? And I'm like, no, I just want to reduce my meat consumption. But yeah, it can be very hard for households that are centered around meat. But I think if you're putting your own personal effort and, like you said, doing your own research, and when you go out, because otherwise we'll just be consuming fries the whole time.
Oh yeah,
or things that are
or
probably
plain
not
noodles.
as good for you. Yeah, exactly. And so you want to make sure your nutrients is up. But yeah, I think it's very interesting. But also, yeah, you're blazing your own path, which I think it's very cool. So you mentioned before that Eugenia was born out of conversations about plant-based obstacles in Hong Kong. What drew you to first see food as a tool for climate activism? Because I feel like there's not as many pages centered around food and activism and how that goes hand in hand.
Yeah. So interestingly, Hong Kong is one of the largest meat consumers. Hong Kong as a country has one of the highest meat consumptions per capita. And I think that's a really striking statistic to be from Hong Kong and learn about industrial agriculture and realize that a lot of the problem is coming from where you are. And so I started falling down this rabbit hole of learning about industrial animal agriculture and how that contributes to environmental injustices and how it's causing a lot of environmental detriments and inequalities, especially because I know in some places where these meat factories and CAFOs are located are typically in neighborhoods where, at least in the US, it's in neighborhoods where there are typically more marginalized people, and so it causes a lot of inequality. And so I think our food choices, as much as an individual choice can have an impact, has very far-reaching potential in terms of tackling climate challenges, but also being more conscious of our food choices, I think, has really large ripple effects on health, on education, on different social inequalities. And so I think it has this really large potential to affect these different factors, which goes a really long way.
Yeah, for sure. I feel like even if you just try to eat less meat, I feel like even that is helpful than if you were to, because not everyone can go all the way. So anything helps, even producing less waste in general. But I think that's really interesting. I did not know that Hong Kong was like had one of the highest meat consumptions. I've actually never been to Hong Kong.
Yeah.
One day.
Hopefully you get to visit.
My mom and sisters all live there, but I haven't been. But I heard the street food is really good.
Yes, a lot of good food and cheap food.
So, can you tell us more about how you designed your interdisciplinary academic path at UNC? How did you know that you wanted to focus on regenerative food systems and global development? Was it because of the meat consumption issue in Hong Kong that led you here, or was it a combination of things?
Yeah, so I actually, funnily enough, when I was applying to universities in my final year of high school, I applied to some programs in psychology and economics, and then the rest was interdisciplinary option. So I always knew I wanted to do something interdisciplinary because I think having different skills and disciplines goes a really long way. Actually, I think I always had an interest in food because of what I mentioned earlier about how it's a tool for activism and how it connects to, it's so interdisciplinary by itself. Like it connects to health, it connects to policy and education and urban development and pretty much everything. And so I knew I wanted to design an interdisciplinary major, and UNC had an option to do that. And I took a class in rural food systems, I think in my third year. And I wanted to do something with global development because I think food systems and agriculture has such a large role to play in defining development in different countries. So, for example, agriculture has the potential to promote social and ecological and economic development in a lot of nations, and it just plays such a big role in shifting the narrative for different places. And I think as I learned more about food systems, I also started to learn about all the different systems that are at play in terms of forming this inequality. And so I started learning about how capitalism plays a role in defining our food choices and how marketing plays a role in defining our food choices. And so there were just so many different avenues I wanted to take that I felt it was most appropriate to create something that was more flexible and wasn't offered by my institution already.
Can you give an example of how capitalism is affecting the way we eat?
Yeah. I think one example is just the chokehold that large corporations have over the food system. And one example is the case of seed sovereignty. And I'm going to use Kenya as an example just because I'm currently here and it's what I'm thinking about more often. And so, for example, there's a piece of legislation that they're subscribed to that basically states that smallholder farmers cannot trade or sell indigenous seeds. And I think that undermines farmers' abilities to acquire seeds that are culturally appropriate and adapted to the environment. And as a result, this gives power to large corporations who determine the type of food that people are eating in these communities. And I think similar cases where when I first started to transition to a plant-based diet, I started eating more avocado and soy, for example. But then I started learning about how these industries are causing so much harm in the countries where they're produced. Ultimately, the problem isn't that individuals are consuming this, but actually companies that are responsible for most of the carbon emissions and also responsible for creating all these challenges in the food system as well. A small handful of companies are dominating the food system, as a result, creating the majority of carbon emissions and causing environmental harm.
Through your Moorhead Kane scholarship, you traveled through, correct me if I'm wrong, Nepal, Amsterdam, Costa Rica, and Ecuador. I'm sure they all shifted your perspective in some way, but is there a memorable moment that really shifted your perspective on food systems and climate justice through your travels?
Yeah, so I studied abroad in Costa Rica in the spring of 2023. And I did my program through the School for Field Studies, and the focus was Sustainable Development Studies. And a core part of this program was doing a lot of field visits and having a very hands-on experiential approach to education. And something that we did a lot was visit farms in Costa Rica, especially cacao and coffee farms. And I think I learned so much from just being on the ground and having these conversations with smallholder farmers and hearing about the challenges that they face with transitioning towards more regenerative practices. And I think that not only exposed me to so many different challenges that they face, but also changed my mindset when it comes to food system work and really reinforce the idea that I need to be having conversations with people, especially diverse stakeholders, so that I can actually make change in a way that's impactful and reaches different people.
Yeah, I really enjoyed my time in Costa Rica. I visited like an animal sanctuary there. So I found the people very welcoming, and I was really surprised by the culture and the sanctuary I stayed on. They were like cooking vegan food that was like Middle Eastern inspired, and yeah, it was really good. I love the philosophy of Pure Vita and how they live. But I agree with you, like hearing issues directly from the people who are actually experiencing is a lot more impactful and also more factual, because I feel like you get the full scope of people on the ground. So I think that's really neat that you got to experience and travel and learn about these issues that are happening in other countries, which I'm sure affect like many of us because we all consume cocoa and other products from other countries. Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And there was a question I was going to ask you previously. Are you going back to Hong Kong, or do you plan to, did you leave Hong Kong and then go study, or are you planning to go back?
Yeah, so I've been away from Hong Kong for the past 5-ish years now, basically since COVID. And after my year-long fellowship here, which ends in August, I'm applying for jobs in Hong Kong right now. I feel like it's been a while since I've been back and would really love to reconnect with my roots. And I think there's so many things that I did throughout my college experience that I had the intention of bringing back to Hong Kong. And so I really want to be able to actually take what I've been learning over these years back home.
That's awesome. So we'll move on to your journey now. I feel like you already spoke about it, but I know you started your page as Vegan HK, and it evolved into Eugenia. Is that how Eugenia? Is that how you say it?
Yeah, Eugenia.
Eugenia, perfect. What was the transformation like, and what made you realize that you had to broaden beyond just plant-based eating? Was that your kind of thought process?
Yeah, it was actually so much of this journey formed as a result of being on social media. I think after I created this Vegan HK platform, I was posting a lot and started discovering a lot of people online who had similar journeys where they learned about one thing and then started falling down these rabbit holes of learning about climate justice and how everything should be intersectional. And I think being in that space really exposed me to this perspective because I was advocating for vegan food, but then I started thinking about how it doesn't, if I'm going to be advocating for plant-based eating for environmental reasons, it doesn't feel appropriate to be choosing plant-based options above eating seasonally, for example. And I was started weighing all these different priorities when it came to food choices, that I started just thinking a lot more deeply about how our food choices relate to climate change, but also climate justice. And I think I started thinking more about the human aspect of food systems. And as I mentioned earlier about food production, like where are these farms located? Who's being impacted most by these factories? And also, how is our upbringing and the neighborhoods that we end up growing up in shape the food we have access to, and who has access to this choice? And so started thinking about all these things that I decided to broaden into more of an environmental page. And I also just wanted to share my appreciation for the environment and exploration in Earth. So I wanted to make it less confined to just vegan food, but more encompassing of all the things that I value and stand for.
Yeah, I can relate because I feel like when you start off in a niche, which is great because you can find your audience, sometimes you feel like you're pigeonholed into just talking about one thing when obviously the world's experiences and your experiences are interdisciplinary and so many things connect. I think you made the right choice, and it's great to see that because we're human, like we connect in so many different ways and we're more than just one thing. So you say you use food as a tool for activism to make complex social justice issues more digestible. Can you walk us through how that works in practice?
Yeah, totally. So I think one example that I can give is I did a research project about food access in Washington, D.C., where essentially I was looking at there are different wards in DC, and they're pretty divided between demographics. And so some are more predominantly Black and brown neighborhoods and low income neighborhoods as well. My friend and I were looking at how food access is divided in these wards and how their neighborhoods are planned in certain ways that maybe prevent them from accessing nutritious groceries. And I think that was one example that made it very clear how, while it'd be great if people are able to make more sustainable food choices, it's not necessarily a choice for everyone. I want people to be aware of all these different structural factors that come into play when it comes to eating and how it's political. Like, the way that neighborhoods were designed years ago has an impact on who is able to have healthy food now. And so I think things like that make me think a lot about food as a tool for activism, and I try to make this accessible to people through social media and through communication as well.
Do you find that it's easier when you have an audience who already knows about these issues? Because I feel like, especially when I'm making my own content, I feel like I have to simplify a lot of things and not use like certain words, because like certain big words that you learn through university are not always, they're not always learned. Do you find you have to simplify a lot of the issues that you talk about?
Yeah, not necessarily simplify, but I do notice that certain things are more engaging to people that are not. I think sometimes when you post things that are more serious and more controversial, people will disengage. And so I think the challenge is finding ways to bring up complex or serious topics without losing your audience. And that's something that I'm trying to balance, because I still want it to be educational, but I don't want it to be a space where people feel judged or feel unwanted because they have different views. And so trying to create an inclusive community, I think, is really important when it comes to making this knowledge accessible.
So how do you navigate promoting plant-based eating in Hong Kong specifically, given the rich food culture there? What misconceptions do you often encounter? Are there like lists of like vegan restaurants online in Hong Kong? Is it like accessible, or do you find it pretty difficult?
Yeah, so this I haven't done in a while just because this was the focus of my platform. Maybe, pre-COVID times. And back then, there were no resources, which is why I started Vegan HK, because I wanted there to be more resources. And so the timing worked out really well in terms of creating that, because I think that's also when people started becoming more aware of these issues and wanting to search for more plant-based options. I would say now there are a lot more resources, but I think one of the misconceptions is just that there was no availability. And I wanted to challenge that misconception, because as you mentioned earlier, like your mom asked you if you were turning Buddhist, because Buddhist communities have been eating vegetarian for the longest time. And I think there's a few neighborhoods in Hong Kong that are very popular with Buddhist vegetarian options. And so when I started discovering all of those, I realized that there have been people here. Also, like, a lot of Indian food is vegetarian. And so all these communities have been eating plant-based over time. And I think we just needed to find the right places. And so it's definitely a misconception that it's not possible, because it's just been the diets of a lot of people for generations.
I agree. Even with a lot of, because I thought it was really hard to eat like plant-based, especially through a lot of Asian cuisines, but there's actually a lot of Buddhist-centered, like vegetarian and vegan like restaurants, even in Ontario. So I was very surprised by that. But once you start to look into it, you can definitely find your people through that. So
yeah,
that's great.
Totally.
So we'll talk a bit about community building. How do you think building community around food and sustainability can lead to systemic change? How important is it to stay united on climate issues, especially given the current scope of things?
Yeah, I think it's one of the most important things to find a community revolving around shared values. I think it's what really sustains activism, and especially when you're feeling burnt out. Sorry, there's a fly. When you're feeling burnt out, it's really important to have people that support you and are driven by the same cause. And honestly, I've met so much of this community through social media, and these people have turned into lifelong friends that I've met in person. It really is so helpful to have people who care about the same things, because, for example, if I am really excited about this climate workshop that's coming up, having someone to go with makes me more eager and willing to go and also being able to talk to or debrief the event with someone else is really crucial to keep momentum after the event. And just being able to bounce ideas off of each other and have that network of people that you can rely on goes a long way.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's specifically important, especially when you're a content creator, because being burnt out is so common. But if you have people supporting you along the way, doing similar things, maybe they're posting content as well, I feel like that also encourages you. But just having a community in general, I think is so important. And I feel like it's becoming lost now because so many people are spending a little too much time on social media versus meeting people in the real world. But I do that you brought up that social media did bring you these connections. So I feel like everything is a tool and we can use it in intentional ways, like you said. And I think I heard the fly for a second.
Yeah, it's won't leave me alone.
That's funny. That's okay.
All part of the process.
Brings us more into your environment there.
Yeah.
You believe knowledge should be accessible and actionable. How do you balance being educational without being preachy? Because I know you said serious topics can really turn people off. Have you found a balance?
Yeah, this is a big thing and something that I think about a lot. Ultimately, what I try to do is to meet people where they are. And so if someone already has an interest in healthcare, for example, how can I bridge what I'm passionate about and what I want to bring into the world? How do I bridge that with where they are as well? So I think food is a perfect example because it already is so interdisciplinary, but how can I connect food systems and inequities in the food system to these different healthcare issues that they're already thinking about? And I think in terms of not being preachy, I try my best to make things lighthearted. And so sometimes that means not making every post that I share a serious or intellectual one. So I try to intersperse a lighthearted, humorous reel every so often, just so people remember that I'm also just trying to have fun. And I think it's really important to do that because people don't want to be bombarded with information all the time, especially when there's already so much information circling around that can weigh heavily on people. So just trying to be mindful of that, I think, has been helpful.
Yeah, I think having fun with all of this is really important because also it helps the content creator as well, because when you're constantly just talking about serious topics and maybe you're just researching a lot of heavy topics, it can really take a toll on your mental health. At least I found that. So finding a way to balance that, I think, not only helps you, but also, I guess, your audience too. What do you think your biggest challenge that you faced living and working on a wildlife reserve, and how has it changed your approach to climate education?
I think maybe this isn't specific to being on a wildlife reserve, but a challenge is probably just the language and cultural barrier. I think it's a bit of a challenge because as much as I am someone who advocates for community-led development and community-led conservation, I am ultimately someone who is not from this community. And so trying to navigate that is something that I'm very conscious of. And especially in my outreach role where I am working with schools and communities, it's really important to make sure that we're balancing or approaching this with cultural sensitivity. And I think that actually relates a lot to the work that I'm doing because, for example, in climate education, there's so many ways to teach about a topic, but if you approach things from the perspective of a community, like there are over 40 tribes in Kenya, and each one of them has its own cultural traditions. And especially I've witnessed some really good instances of conservation education where they'll really integrate these cultural pieces into the way they teach things. And I think that is really powerful when they feel seen in the way that they're taught and things resonate with them on a personal level. I think that can carry a lot of weight in conservation and climate education.
Do you feel that there's often like a language barrier, or maybe I believe when you know multiple languages, I'm sure you probably know Cantonese and English and maybe other languages, you have different perspectives, or sometimes you find that there's not a word to describe something in the language. For example, maybe there's not really a word for environmental justice, maybe in a certain language. Do you find that there's a barrier in language in terms of communicating to the community that you're working with?
Not so much in that sense, but I have noticed the power of language to articulate different relationships to the environment. So, for example, I was in Ecuador for a little bit looking at the rights of nature laws, and it was fascinating to learn about how I think it was in Quechua, in one of the indigenous Ecuadorian languages, they're like the way they frame objects, environmental objects, is very different from the way we do it in English. And I think automatically the way they describe them gives life to a mountain or it gives life to an ocean. And I think that in itself changes the way that they frame and value the environment, which in effect shapes their understanding and relationship to the natural world. And that was really fascinating to learn. And I think it goes a long way because clearly it's influenced legislation in places like Ecuador. And I think that has been very interesting in terms of cultural differences and language.
Yeah, I feel like I remember learning about how English can be a little limited in how we speak about the environment, because even the word environment itself is very separate from us. But in other like cultures and religions, like Buddhism, for example, when they speak about the environment, they speak about how we're all interconnected and how we're all one. And so I feel like the way you place yourself in relation to the environment can be really important too. I like how you highlighted that as well. For a personal struggle, do you ever feel like the weight of climate issues is just too much sometimes? Like, how do you maintain hope while doing this kind of work?
Yeah, I think similar as what I mentioned earlier, the thing that really sustains me is finding community and finding like-minded people who are passionate about the cause. And I think ultimately most people who act upon climate issues are motivated by a sense of love for the environment. And that's a lot of what drives me personally. And so being able to go for a hike, for example, or go into nature and just indulge in what nature has to offer is one of the ways that I maintain hope while doing this kind of work and how I remind myself of the importance of this work as well.
Yeah, I feel like something as simple as going on a hike or getting outside is so helpful, because when you're within the four walls of your home and just watching the news of how everything's crumbling, you just go outside and you see that, hey, the trees are okay, the sun is out, like things are going to be okay. So I know you talked a bit about what you learned living on a wildlife reserve, but is there something that you've found that's really been pivotal or something that you'll carry along for you for many years to come in terms of what you've learned through conservation and actually doing the work on the ground through the wildlife reserve that you couldn't have learned through academic study?
Yeah, I think something as simple as just an appreciation for biodiversity. I think I've always loved nature and loved learning about nature, but something about so I'm at a wildlife research center, and most people here are either ecologists or biologists and people who are deeply studying one part of the ecosystem, and just seeing the way they light up when they see one particular plant or one particular species has really inspired me to pay more attention to the environment. And I have never been into birds, but being here, I'm so excited about the idea of going for a bird walk and listening to the birds chirping and trying to identify what birds they are, because I think the passion that people have for the natural world is so infectious here and has really impacted me in a way that being in an academic setting wouldn't have been able to.
I'm sure the wildlife itself is probably pretty incredible there and quite different from the wildlife in Hong Kong too. So that's really awesome. But I agree, the passion that people have for things like the environment can really have a huge impact on you, I found, especially with teachers in university or high school. If they were super passionate about a topic, I could get into anything. I'm terrible at math, but my high school teacher was super passionate about calculus, and I was like, okay, I'm passionate too now.
Yeah,
infectious. So how has your experience across different countries influenced your belief in culturally informed solutions to climate change? I know you talked a bit about your separate experiences, but do you think that like culture in general is important to climate solutions?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's important to respect cultural values and cultural approaches. And it's been very interesting to be here and think about this, because a lot of the researchers that come here are coming from abroad, but a lot of the most valuable knowledge comes from local research assistants, people who have been on this land for generations, who know how to predict when rain is going to come. Just, I don't know, they have a fifth sense for it. And people who just have this connection with nature that can only be developed through growing up on this land. And I think recognizing that is so important for climate solutions, because we can't just apply a blanket solution to every part of the world. It's very necessary and crucial that we integrate all these local perspectives and ways of knowing into solutions that we create. And I think that's something that's been really reinforced during my time here.
Yeah, I think that's so important because I feel like a lot of big Western projects, especially that are based in like Africa and other countries, I feel like often like they can give blanket solutions to issues, especially if they don't go and visit and be part of the culture and the land or whatever the issue they're studying. If they're not actually there, it can be hard to put two and two together. So I think it's so important to actually be there and connect with land and the people, like you said. So what is one thing you wished more people understood about our food choices and how they connect to the broader environmental and social issues?
Yeah, I guess the main thing is just how interdisciplinary food is. And I think one thing that I've learned through this journey is just the importance of education, and not just educating people about food choices, but starting food education from a really young age. And there's this organization called Edible Schoolyard that I visited in San Francisco, but they also have a branch in New York. And they really integrate edible education into their curriculum. And so from a young age, they're teaching students how to grow their own food, teaching students how to use that food to create meals, and also learning about nutrition through hands-on learning. And I think that's really important to start from a young age, because it fosters a love for the environment and care for the environment from the very start. And that evolves into a sustained commitment to environmental stewardship.
Sorry, what did you say the organization was called? Edible Schoolyard. Thank you. Yeah, that sounds really cool. It sounds like they can also actually eat some of the stuff that they're probably introduced to. So I feel like that's even more of another layer of experience that they have. Okay, great. So I know you're looking forward to going back to Hong Kong. How do you see conversations about sustainability evolving there? What gives you hope?
Yeah, so I think there is definitely more conversation about environmental sustainability in Hong Kong and in everywhere for that matter. Recently, the government opened a consultation for the Biodiversity and Conservation Plan for 2025 to 2030, I believe. And I think it gives me hope to see that the government is consulting the population and inviting people to provide feedback on how to move forward. And I think conservation is not something that I thought about as much when I was there as compared to now where I'm living at a wildlife reserve. But I think it's very hopeful and important that Hong Kong's doing this, because we actually have, I think it's not common knowledge to people, but Hong Kong has a lot of wetlands and a lot of areas that are crucial for the environment. And it's really important that we protect those. And I just hope that's something that is a priority in the future, or now into the future.
Yeah, I didn't even know that there were wetlands in Hong Kong. I feel like when people think of Hong Kong, they think of like a city, like it's just like concrete and tall buildings. But my mom said when she was growing up there, one of her favorite field trips was just going to the river. They would just play in the water and splash around. So I feel like that also gives a connection to the environment, especially when you're young. I think it's so important to have that kind of influence. So yeah, we're in our last section for this interview. So I want to ask you, what's next for you? What are your goals for continuing to bridge conservation science and climate education? Do you think you'll continue with conservation, or do you think you'll go back more to food systems? And how do you see your work evolving?
Something I've learned from being here is that conservation and food systems are so connected. And I'm really excited to go back to Hong Kong. One of the reasons is that I'm excited to learn about Hong Kong through a conservation lens. I think growing up there, I was just going to school every day. I didn't have that much time to dedicate to learning outside of the classroom, but this is the first time I'll be going back as an adult and have the opportunity to actually define how my days are spent a bit more. And so I'm really eager to just explore more. And I want to visit more farms. There's like a region called New Territories in Hong Kong that's home to a lot of farms that, yeah, people don't hear that much about. And I want to go there, talk to those farmers, elevate those conversations through social media. But I also want to learn more about the wetlands and the birds and basically just treat home as it's a wildlife reserve or something, and to take this same approach I've had this year to going back home and really just learning about the green side of Hong Kong as well.
That's awesome. I loved how you said that to bring your own experience of living on a wildlife reserve to Hong Kong and learn, be like a maybe like a tourist or like a research scientist in your own town. And I think that's really exciting. I'm looking forward to seeing the content you produce there, because I love to learn since I've never been to Hong Kong as well. So how do you think people can get involved in supporting regenerative food systems and conservation efforts from where they are right now in the world?
Yeah, I think the easiest thing is to find a farm. There's often experiences where you can do coffee picking if you're somewhere in a coffee growing region, or you can do strawberry picking and just start with that activity, but make an effort to talk to the farmer and learn about what they're doing, learn about what they're struggling with, what the challenges are, and start there. I think that's the easiest way you can get involved directly with the food systems and have that hands-on approach that is so important for all these other fields as well.
Yeah, that's awesome. I feel like there's a lot of farms where I live too, so I think getting involved with how your food is grown is so important, and just in general to learn. Okay, so my second to last question is, what do you want your legacy to be? How do you hope the world will be different because of the work that you do?
Yeah, so one philosophy that I really like to advocate for, and I used to have a podcast that I'm hoping to restart soon, maybe when I go back to Hong Kong, called The Everyday Activist. And the whole idea behind this podcast is that there's no one size fits all approach to activism. And it's a lot of what I'm still advocating for now with conservation, that you don't need a science degree to work in this space. And I want people to recognize that whatever their strengths are, whatever their skills are, it has a role in the environmental movement. And there isn't one set way for someone to contribute to environmental change, but just bring who you are and there'll be a space for you to make change.
I think that's awesome. I feel like there's often people see a barrier between themselves and the work they want to do. I hope you start that podcast, because we definitely need more perspectives and just more people sharing their story of the work that they do and how it can happen for you. And I feel your story and other people's stories really allow people to see themselves through your work. Thank you so much. Can you share where people can find you? If you have a website, I know we have an Instagram, but you can share your handle and basically where people can reach out to you or follow you.
Yeah, so my username for most things is Eugenia. So it's EUGREENIA. And so that's a play on my name and with the word green in it. So that's my Instagram. That's also my website, eugenia.com. And if you want to find me on LinkedIn, it's just Eugenia, CHOW.
Perfect. I'll add you there.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Eugenia. I learned a lot and I thought this was really helpful, and I'm sure other people will learn a lot from this as well and be inspired and see that they can actually do this type of work. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of The Thoughtful Advocate. I hope that Eugenia's story reminds you that no journey has a one-size-fits-all story. In university, everyone is switching majors left and right. I switched mine a couple times too, and that's totally normal, because as humans, we are multifaceted. We have different interests in different things. We're not going to know right away, like, what are we going to do with the rest of our life? It's something that is trial and error, just like jobs, and I've had so many. And you just have to do it to see if you enjoy it. So whether your passion is through food, storytelling, conservation, or community, your unique perspective matters in this movement. If this episode sparks something in you, leave a review, share it with a friend, leave a review, or tag us on Instagram at The Thoughtful Advocate. As always, I'd love to hear from you if this resonated, and I'd love to hear who do you like to hear from next, whether that's a guest you've been wanting to hear their real story from. Till next time. Okay, so today's sponsor is Kind Laundry. Just kidding, they're not really a sponsor, but I do have an affiliate code. Kind Laundry use natural ingredients, and it actually comes in these sheets. So much more useful than liquid laundry detergent because that stuff gets messy. With Kind Laundry, you can bring this anywhere. It's literally in a box, pack in your suitcase, and it's that easy. You can get 10% off by using code ZeroWasteCute.